So this is one of the more advanced crash courses. If you are just working on the fundamentals of the language, I would encourage you to tune out, possibly even move further away where I'm not going to accidentally be pointing and calling at you, although I'll probably do it anyway. The idea here is we want to give you the kind of 15-minute overview of the essentials you need to know in order to participate in writing Backbone apps and reading Backbone code and understanding what's going on. And then you'll have about 15 minutes to work on whatever projects you are already kind of like dabbling in, and our TAs can circulate and support you. If you're not going to be listening to the Backbone crash course, and you're going to be instead working on the curriculum that's provided for the mainline fundamentals work, the TAs will support you for that too. Feel free to just flag one down. As a reminder, and since there are so many people here, who haven't been to some of the previous lectures since it's more advanced, I'd just like to give you a quick heads up about the format of this class. Point number one, it's highly interactive. And when I call on you, the intent is not to kind of like screw up your day. The intent is to check myself to see how well I've done communicating a concept. And if you've been here already, you know that the following is true. You will be shocked at how difficult it is for you and the people around you to simply reiterate sentences I've just said. That turns out to be extremely difficult. Tracking on what a speaker has to say is so difficult, in fact, that I have learned to demilitarize, if you will, the idea of not knowing the answer and being called upon and all of the embarrassment that could be accompanied with that. We kind of try to throw that out the window in this format. So be ready to be called on and know that when you don't understand the answer and barely understand the question, you are very representative of everyone else in the room, and it's okay. It's the only way I can do a good job of communicating. So, the second point that I'd like you to know is that it's very important that you be actually making something or doing something with the information we provide. That's why we have all of these TAs here this week, is so that we can actually work with you on your actual problems. If you stick around, you can work on some of the fundamental materials. Those are, the curriculum for that is findable at JSConf2014.hackreactor.com. You'll find some curriculum there at a GitHub repo. You can download it and start working through the assignments, and the TAs will circulate. Some of it needs a bit more sort of personal instruction, and much of it is supported by these lectures. So, to take a brief diversion into this advanced crash course, I'm going to tell you this is not advanced for people who already know Backbone. This is advanced for people just learning JavaScript. The following talk is going to be very fast introduction to a framework, but it will not have much pertinent information to you if you are already writing Backbone code. Make sense? Okay, so to get things kicked off, can I get a show of hands of people who are in the room because of the fundamental curriculum, and that's what they plan to keep working on through the talk? A little bit. And can I get a show of hands of people who are in the room because they want to hear the short version of how to write Backbone code? Okay. So with that in mind, I'm going to start calling people on people at random. If I accidentally mistake you as being in the Backbone crew, just correct me and tell me you just are totally tuned out. It's fine. So what I want to know is where you're starting, what you're doing with Backbone, so that I can make sure that I'm speaking to your actual experience and your use case. Can I get a sense of what you do with Backbone or don't do with Backbone, or why you chose to come to this session?
I have no experience in Backbone. I've only started writing JavaScript UIs, although I've experienced in non-dynamically typed languages.
Perfect. Okay, that's very helpful. No experience in Backbone, moderate experience in JavaScript. What about you there?
No experience in Backbone. I'm a back-end kind of guy. I know JavaScript well. I don't understand what our front-end guys doing with Backbone, so I can have helpful there.
Experienced back-end coder, knows JavaScript well, never touched Backbone, wants to speak to the development workflow that the front-end guys are using. with an informed sense. And as a calibration mechanism for me, when you say you know JavaScript well, what does the object.create function do?
New instance of a blank object.
A new instance of a blank object. Close enough. Yeah, that's the 80th% answer. I love it. Subtle difference, object.create generates a new object that does property delegation to the input object. But I think you knew that. Okay, sweet. And one more, you there, with the sort of plaid-like shirt.
Yes.
What's your Backbone situation?
I do consulting. I work for a company that's consulting, and so I think just to get a more broad picture of architectural solutions. And I've touched Backbone a little bit in existing situations, but haven't built anything from the ground up.
Got it. So played with a little Backbone code when you encounter it. Haven't written any apps from scratch. Consulting experience in JavaScript, it sounds like. Okay, cool. Well then what we have planned is pretty well targeted at what it seems as though you guys need. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring you in on some of the lingo of Backbone. I'm going to show you the key words, and I don't mean keywords in the JavaScript keyword sense. I mean the words that you are going to see when you're writing or reading Backbone code that have special meaning to the Backbone library and to the Backbone community. For whatever reason, the significance of these words is pretty disparately documented. You don't find, in my experience, a central list of what it is you need to have heard of and how you need to interpret certain words. But the Backbone library will treat these words very in super special ways. Although documentation exists for each of these words that you will find yourself typing in a Backbone app, they don't seem to just be consolidated in one kind of like glossary. And that's kind of how I'm approaching this. I'm going to tell you the terms, and as I tell you the terms, I'm going to kind of like paint a picture of why you might use this term and how it has special meaning. One of the Backbone tenets that seems to silently guide how the framework was written is that the keywords we're going to see, the key terms that we're going to see here, are assumed to have inherent meaning to the developers of the framework about the workflow of writing a web app. Initialize is a great example. If you've seen any Backbone code, you've seen the word initialize pop up here and there. You may or may not realize that anything stored at the key initialize is likely to be treated very specially by Backbone. When Backbone interacts with the objects that you build and hand to it, and it sees something at the key initialize, it does something very interesting. And it's somewhat assumed that you are going to intuit the significance of special words, and that you are also going to intuit which words you should use to express ideas you already have in your mind. My goal here is to connect ideas you're already familiar with words you've probably seen, and kind of make it clear that seeing those words means something special in this library. So first of all, the types of words you will see whenever you're interacting with a constructor. Backbone.model is one of the primary constructors that Backbone provides. It allows you to build one of the three pillars of the MVC architecture that Backbone is trying to support. If you're not super familiar with MVC, here's the few sentence version. MVC architecture claims that you can divide your application into at least 3 distinct parts, and that in so doing, the code that you find in any one of those parts should look very homogeneous and similar to the rest of the code you will find there. It will all have a similar character, and there won't be a lot of conflicting or disparate goals in one silo, one of these 3 silos. It'll all be about the same goal. It's generally good practice in software engineering to separate your concerns, and that's the intent of MVC. Each of these terms refers to a different aspect of the application, and they are interpreted somewhat differently from architecture, from framework to framework. I'll offer you my most general version. Model represents the data and the rules about how we get to manipulate that data. View represents what is seen by the user, and there's a major disconnect between those two, right? Model and view should feel as different as truth and perception. There's clearly a big difference between truth and perception. There's only one truth. It's out there to be measured and observed, but it doesn't change. Whereas perception varies from person to person and can be mistaken and is a bit of a transformation on truth. The same is true of models and views. There may be many views that all represent a single model, that represent a single piece of data, but that one piece of data is where we will hold the rules governing how it can change over time. Lastly, controller. The notion of a controller is not particularly used in JavaScript, but in general it means the thing that manages user input. That is the most general definition I can find or think of for a controller. Luckily, we're not going to have to dig into that too much to understand Backbone, so let's just focus on model and view. Before I move on, I would like to make sure that you guys feel comfortable with the premise of Backbone and the intent of an MVC architecture well enough that it will start to make sense how Backbone is solving those problems for you. How comfortable do you guys feel trying to defend the MVC architecture to a room full of people if you were called upon? Thumbs up, that would be easy for me. Thumbs down, you only said it once, this is terrifying. Thumbs middle, I've kind of heard of it for a long time, so I feel like maybe I can take a stab at it. Could you take a stab at it with the hat there?
Sure. So, model view controller is a separation of concerns in order to help you kind of organize your code into silos.
Yep, that's great. And how would you distinguish what models are versus what views are, ignoring completely controllers for a moment?
The model being the data and everything, the view being the presentation of the data.
Great. The model being the data, and the view being the presentation. Let me tweak the first one. Model is not only the data, but also the rules that govern how that data can change. Those are the methods that get attached to, in an object-oriented sense, the methods that govern the internal consistency of any one object and how it can interact with other objects. Great. So basically programs you've written that have no user interface, programs that like do simulations, physics simulations, would not necessarily need any presentation, and so all of the object-oriented principles can work quite well because it's just in a computer, it's just truth, kind of colliding with other truth, right? As soon as you try to present that to a user, you have to distort truth such that it fits on a computer screen. Sometimes you duplicate the way that you're presenting a thing. You'll present a single fact twice. The number of unread messages is 7. You show that in several different ways. There's an unread count in the upper right corner, and there's a number of messages that you can see, and then there's like one next to your inbox. There's just all of these places that the same fact shows up. That is not true about models. Models try to consolidate truth in one spot, and views have all of these different rules. So that is my crash course in MVC, so that we can start to understand what Backbone is trying to offer us. Backbone.model is a constructor that will allow us to create these objects to encapsulate truth and behavior around a given entity in our system. So if we have a user, we might want a Backbone model to represent that user. Backbone.view is a constructor to generate the projection into user visible space of that model. And then Backbone.collection is quite similar to a Backbone.model. A Backbone.collection, an instance of a Backbone.collection, is intended to be sort of an array-like structure that can contain many Backbone.models. Ideally, Backbone.collection would have been a subclass of Backbone.model, in much the same way that JavaScript arrays are a subclass of JavaScript objects. But unfortunately, they did not make this design choice when they wrote the framework, and so a lot of the things that you come to value about models won't be true of collections, even though intuitively you might think that they ought to be. I personally agree that they ought to be, if that's how you feel, but we live in this world instead of the one I want to be in. When you are interacting with these constructors, you may choose to subclass them, and in fact you will have to subclass them pretty quickly. If you're going to make an application with models and with views, you're probably going to customize the generic model and the generic view to be useful in your application. As soon as you decide you need something other than the very vanilla Backbone.model instance or Backbone.view instance, and heads up, you'll basically never want a vanilla version of those, you immediately need to subclass them and start specifying how your models are interesting, or how your views are interesting. Perhaps you know an instantiation pattern in JavaScript, like functional instantiation. Or perhaps you know pseudo-classical instantiation, using the keyword new and setting the .prototype property on your constructor function, etc., etc. If you do know those things, bully for you, you have to sort of ignore that pattern, whatever pattern you know, or patterns, and you have to use a new pattern of defining a constructor that Backbone has created for you, with the hopes of simplifying your process of writing a constructor and writing a class. If you want to make a new class, you're going to say backbone.model.extend. You'll pass in a hash that kind of helps specify what your class should behave like, and it'll return you a new class. If this is a little confusing, right, the extend function seems to be a factory that produces classes. That's reasonable. We are calling a function that returns a class so that we can use that class to create instances. Thumbs on whether you could explain to me what I mean when I say Backbone.extend is a factory that produces classes, that produces instances. Okay, so that means we need to go over it a little more. So, Backbone has eschewed the traditional instantiation and subclassing systems that you use in JavaScript. You're likely to be using the pseudo-classical pattern. It's okay if you haven't heard that word. It's the one that's documented all over the internet. .prototype, keyword new, keyword this, all sorts of stuff. Like everything you've read about instantiation and subclassing is probably about the pseudo-classical pattern. There is a much simpler alternative called functional that nobody uses, except a few super elite people. You can't use that either. Backbone says you must use our system for generating classes. You don't get to write them out manually. You just tell Backbone about your class, and it generates it for you. The way that you tell Backbone about your class is by calling a function. So imagine for a moment that I was going to start building factories. I want a car factory. So I start putting bricks on top of bricks, and I install this big piece of machinery and a sort of like conveyor belt for the line, and hooks to carry things around, and I'm done with my factory, and now I can build cars. There's one factory. And then I go over here. Mind you, this is a complicated process. Building a factory in JavaScript, building a class, is easy to screw up. So I made one, and I'm doing good, and then I decide to make a second factory. I go over here, and I start stacking bricks on top of bricks, and I put other machinery in. This is a boat factory over here. I finish building my boat factory, and I'm like, wow, I am tired. I wish I could just do something, call some high-level function, and have it produce factories, right? That is what Backbone is trying to give you with this .extend idea. The .extend function, the .extend method of Backbone.model is a generator that generates classes in much the same way as if I had a magical box that when I pressed a button, out popped a brand new factory. I'd say, car has wheels, and it goes plop, and it makes a factory that can produce cars. And I go, boat, it's floaty, and pop, out comes another factory. That's a pretty fair analogy for the .extend that you'll find on all Backbone classes. When you make a Backbone class using .extend, it produces a class that also has .extend on it. The class it produces is a subclass of whatever you were .extending. If you say backbone.model.extend, you get a subclass of backbone.model. So maybe you say var user equals backbone.model.extend, and you specify something about how it works. And all of a sudden, the user variable stores a class. You can now say var superuser equals user.extend and pass in some specifications there. So my point is, you want to think about Backbone classes. You'll notice that they have capitalized letters like M for model, B, C, and that's a different C in MVC. When you see those, that's when you know you can use .extend. When you build a subclass, you can use .extend there as well. Any questions about the story of you writing subclasses of the primitive Backbone classes, or subclasses of your own subclasses? I feel as though there better be at least one question. I'm pretty confident something wasn't clear.
What was the question?
That's my question. I'm just curious if anybody has a question.
What goes into the extend?
Great, we're going to cover that next. But what goes into extend is a fantastic question. Behind you there? Oh, you, yes.
I was kind of thinking the same thing. Maybe there's.
How do we use this extend function? Perfectly reasonable. That's the next slide. But I don't mean to stop valid questions. Are there any others?
How do you create instances of classes?
The instantiation story is the same as regular JavaScript pseudo-classical instantiation. You just say new and then the class name. Cool. Okay. So I said that you were going to tell this .extend method what you want your class to be like. All constructors expect you to pass in a params hash. That's going to look like two curly braces in between these parentheses. Those curly braces define an object, and that object specifies what your class is supposed to be like. I'm going to go into what kinds of properties you put on that object so that you can specify a class in the next slide. But the point is, you must pass a params hash into this .extend in order to generate anything meaningful using .extend. That's the one argument that .extend expects. A list of, a collection of key value pairs that explain to Backbone what your new class should be like. Does that make sense? It's kind of like when I whispered, it's floaty, over to my special machine. We got to offer some input. The form of the input is a params hash. So, starting to talk about what goes into that params hash. The most important, in most cases, the most important special property is initialize. Initialize is the key that you will use to talk about some function that should be run on every new instance. I'm going to do a quick code sample. So in Backbone, I might say var user equals, you all read this okay? Var user equals backbone.model.extend. And inside here, so my params hash, just to be clear, is this thing. And inside here, I would like to specify what my class is supposed to be like. I'm going to say initialize, because this is perhaps the most important thing to specify. I am now typing out the code that should be run whenever a new instance of this class gets made. So I might say, for example, this dot location, this dot, what do users have? Age, this dot age equals, default age is going to be 0. Later, the user can set the age, right? Or let's say this dot profile pic equals random random avatar. So in this example, every new user instance is going to get a random picture as their avatar for as long as the application is running. What does the initialize function do with the classes?
That's the function that runs when you instantiate the class.
Yes, yes, whenever you create an instance of the class, this code will run on the brand new instance. Does that mean that the highlighted function is in fact the constructor? Sorry, talking to the fellow behind
Either it
you.
is,
If I may take a brief moment to explain why I was such a jerk just now. There is an illusion that we all suffer from in classes where it appears as though everyone understands stuff better than us, but it tends to be the case that that's just because you only talk when you know the answer. And so looking around you, you'll see a lot of people who are not confused by whatever you're confused about, but in fact they are. They just didn't happen to be talking then. So I try to avoid that by only talking to people that I select on a random basis. No.
I come back, so.
Absolutely. I apologize. So does that mean that this function is the constructor itself?
either it is the constructor or the constructor will in fact call this function.
That's a great way to say it. He said either this highlighted function is the constructor itself, or the constructor is going to call this function. So in fact, just for your edification, Backbone generates a new constructor function that is not the highlighted function, and that new constructor function will run this on every new instance. It's a slight disambiguation, and in practice, you're not going to notice a difference. You're going to write this as if it was the constructor function that gets returned, and that capital U user is going to hold. The .extend method returns some function that doesn't happen to be the highlighted one, but the return function will call the highlighted one. Does that make sense? Yes?
Do those stack? If you were to extend this one, will both initialize get called by the constructor?
Good question. If we subclass user to make super user, will the subclass automatically call the superclass instantiate, the superclass initialize? And the answer is no. Unfortunately, you have to specify that manually. You could argue that it's preferable that you have to specify it manually. Have you ever written any Python? What languages are you most comfortable with?
Ruby on Rails, C#.
So in Ruby, it's not super, but there's some way that you call the super version of a method, right?
Yeah.
There was monkey patching for a long time, and then they replaced that with some new construct, right?
Yeah.
What is it?
Well,
Is it called super?
Yeah.
Oh, sweet.
Yeah.
So the requirement that you call your superclass initializer in Backbone is analogous to the fact that in Ruby you probably have to call super, and you would prefer to be able to specify when and where that super call happens.
So you can do something that's analogous to super here? Is there a keyword that lets you?
Unfortunately, JavaScript does not make it possible, certainly not easy, and I would argue not possible, to implement super-like behavior that is actually consistent in how it operates. I've seen a lot of people make very valiant attempts, but I've never seen a version of super that works as expected in all cases. So no, unfortunately, the framework developers didn't put, or rather fortunately, they did not attempt to give you a broken super feature. Instead, they just leave it up to you to say, in your super user subclass, you would say, let me just show you. In your super user subclass, you would say user.apply this. If you're not familiar with this line, it's okay. That's what we're going over at 4. We're going to explain exactly what this craziness is about. But again, this is the crash course in Backbone, so sorry if that particular thing seems obscure. So this is pretty much what you needed to know about constructors in Backbone. Are there any questions before we move on to some of the other key terms? Things about constructors. Radical. Let's talk about instances. So constructors are like the factories that produce similar objects that you're going to be needing a lot of. There are different rules for each of these things. When I am interacting with a model instance, what I expect of a Backbone model instance is that it will intercede on my interactions with the properties of that object. A regular JavaScript object, I would say, hey, object.propertyName. What are you? I'd alert object.propertyName. I would do something like this. I would say, var foo equals some object. And then I would say alert foo dot bar. This should access the bar property on foo, yeah? In Backbone, you don't do it this way. You say foo equals new, user, where user is a Backbone model. And I'll pass in some params. Let's say, let's say that bar is equal to 3. Now, all of a sudden, I can't access foo.bar. Foo is no longer a vanilla JavaScript object. Instead, I'm forced to interact with it via getters and setters. So I would call the get function, and I would pass in the string bar. And Backbone would do the work of that lookup for me. But Marcus, isn't that really annoying? Yes, it is. Later, I would want to set foo.bar, or rather foo's bar attribute, and I'd say foo.set bar to be 7. This is a big, big, big problem. There's a lot of reasons this is a problem. Some of the reasons involve the fact that a lot of libraries were written in history that rely on vanilla property access. But Backbone does not play by those rules, in part because JavaScript does not offer enough features for Backbone to do what Backbone promises, using vanilla property access. So, what they've chosen to do is require that users of the Backbone library call .get and .set every time they want an attribute of a model. Are there any questions about getters and setters as they relate to models? Yeah?
Is there any way around doing that?
Is there any way not to use getters and setters? The only thing, and you definitely shouldn't do this, the only thing you could do is ignore the existence of the .get and .set and just start tacking properties onto the model object itself. The problem is you will be skirting around all of the framework that you've downloaded and meticulously installed and used in your project, and you won't have any of the features that Backbone promises. So perhaps a more accurate answer is no, there's no way around it, but technically you can just ignore them. Yeah.
So what is the actual reason?
I'm so glad you asked. I was going to insist that someone ask a question until that came up. Why did they introduce getters and setters? So, what's that?
Change notification.
Change notifications. In a word, or in 2 words, it's change notifications. JavaScript doesn't provide an API. JavaScript objects do not provide any interface that allows you to listen for changes to a model, or to an object. At least not until very recently. And since it's not cross-platform yet, we can't really rely on it. So, since Backbone is attempting to facilitate an automatic relationship between models and views, to keep views in sync with models, so that you don't have to maintain consistency yourself. You want to just interact with your models and trust that the transformation out to the view is working on its own. That's the whole value prop of Backbone. Since Backbone says, hey, play by our rules, and you won't have to think so hard about the consistency of your view and maintaining its parity with the truth that is reflected in your model system, if Backbone's going to make that promise, it needs to know when the model changes. So it imposes this constraint. It turns out there are rather cleverer solutions to this problem, but they're not very intuitive. And the other frameworks kind of started using them. They have their drawbacks. If you want the simplest framework, Backbone is a good choice because it makes a lot of dead simple choices. If you want the simplest application after having used the framework, you should probably pick something else because Backbone leads to very complicated applications, if that makes sense. It offers so little, and the ways that it offers you things can be unintuitive or even misleading. You only want to use it on projects that are of a scale that are supported by the feature. That said, a lot of high-scale websites are using Backbone and making it do backflips for their own purposes. I certainly don't mean to disparage the Backbone community or the framework designers, but they were designing for a very specific design intent and a very specific use case. They did not want to see their framework get overly complicated on the inside, and as a result, a lot of the choices we have to make as developers within the Backbone framework can be overwrought at times. Cool. Collections. As I mentioned before, collections are basically models. They're basically array-like models, or they can be thought of as such. They follow a lot of the same rules conceptually, but they lack some of the infrastructure that you would hope for from a model. For example, they don't have getters and setters. They have index accessors. You can get and set different values from the middle or the end or the beginning of the sequence, the ordinally sequenced values that the collection stores. But you don't get .get and .set on arbitrary keys. This can be problematic if you have, for example, a playlist, and the playlist is supposed to contain many songs, but the playlist also has some attributes like title and owner. You won't have access to .get and .set such that you can sort of maintain those things over time. You instead have to do some like collection inside a model type solution. Are there any questions about collections so far? Cool. All right. Wait a minute. What time did we start? 3? Whoa! Time flies when there's a lot of people staring at you. All right, we're on the last slide. Special input parameters. When you are defining a view or collection or model class. So in the process of defining a view, a model, or a collection, this word has meaning, as we've explored. When you are defining a view class, or when you're defining a collection class, the word model has meaning. Every view has a model because a view is a projection of some collection of truth. A profile widget is a projection of the truth about a user. So every time you're defining a view class, you want to ask yourself, what model powers this class? Same is true of a collection. A collection is a collection of some type of thing. You want to specify what type of thing it's supposed to be a collection. When you're defining a view class, you want to specify what should happen when the user interacts with that view. This is as close as Backbone gets to having a controller. User input will come in the form of clicks and general targeting activity on some DOM node, and that DOM node is probably represented by a view object, right? So they're interacting with that profile widget that is a projection of the user object. You want a way of specifying all of the reactions that should happen for all of those types of events. It's called the events hash because when defining a view class, you will of course have initialize as usual, but you may also have an events hash. Events is going to be things like click on .user or like follow. When people click on the follow button of the user profile, you want this function to run. It's just a mapping of, oops, not mean to run that. What's happening? The code you type here is whatever you expect to happen when the user clicks the button with class follow on it. So it's just a mapping from event specification, event specifier, including the target that is to be interacted with, to functionality that you want to happen. There are two conventions that are rather interesting for view classes. You're going to specify the render operation. This is not a special keyword per se, it's just everybody calls, for every view, there's some way of transforming the model into a glob of HTML or into a DOM node object. Whatever you're rendering to, your render function does the work of checking out the model, right? Every view has one associated model. Checking out the model and projecting it into whatever HTML or DOM node the render operation is supposed to produce. It's kind of up to you whether you use DOM nodes or HTML. Backbone doesn't really prescribe anything in that regard. Sometimes your render operation is going to rely on a template. If that's the case, you'll probably store it at .template. So, just to be clear, those would show up here. And this just makes the function available so that I can call, my profile view object .render and get the currently updated rendered version of it. Any questions about render and template? Yeah.
I just have a question about models and views in general. Is a view always tied to a single model only?
Yes.
Okay, so if you wanted to display multiple models on a page, you'd need multiple views?
So the question is a view always tethered to one model only? And my answer is basically yes. There are some exceptions to this. The first is your view could be a view of a collection. In which case, you would see, if it was like a view of the tweet stream, it would map to a collection that represents all of the tweets in that stream. But really, it's pointing at one model, which is to say a collection, which is like an almost model. The other way in which this is not quite true is you will sometimes build objects, model objects, whose sole job is to encapsulate together all of the things needed to render a given view. Ideally, you don't have to consider the view while you're designing your model architecture, but in practice that isn't always true. Sometimes you got to say, well, in order to make this kind of renderable using the Backbone paradigm, I'm going to have to structure my model differently than I would probably like to, just to make sure that the view has access to all the right stuff. It is an anti-pattern, and this is sort of extracurricular recommendation for me about MVC. It's not related to Backbone, it's universal. It is an anti-pattern, a bad idea, to allow any view to get access to models other than whatever model it's directly projecting. By doing so, you open the floodgates to all of the, basically a view being influenced by any code anywhere in your system. A view should never have knowledge of more models than the one it's projecting, and it should never have knowledge of any views around it other than its direct children. There's such a thing as a child view. It's the only case where a view should know about another view.
Just to clarify, the view should not have access to any other model than its own model.
Yes.
And even that statement, should we clarify further and say the framework only allows the view to have access to its model, but there's no...
No, the proposal was, couldn't we just say Backbone enforces that a view does not have access to anything but its own single model? And the fact is it does not. It is extremely easy for you, the developer, to save references to models all over the place, willy-nilly, and then make your views go reference those other models. Now, the framework makes it easy to get access to exactly one model, but it's almost as easy to circumvent the thing they facilitated. Great question.
So the framework kind of requires you to more or less pollute the model if you need to incorporate some things that you want to render in a view that's technically not strictly part of your.
So the question is, if I have a view that needs to project more than just a single model, is the Backbone framework basically requiring me to forego the assurances of this wonderful rule about don't let a view talk to more models than its own? And in fact, it's not the Backbone framework that's imposing that problem. It's the nature of the example you're giving. The example you're giving presupposes that there is a projection of more than one model. And I would claim that the best solution in those cases is to get your view to project some higher order model that encompasses everything. I, for example, write very few applications that don't have an app model. I believe it's the case that the business logic, the model logic, generally requires us to have a model of the application that the user is experiencing that is projected by the app view. This is an architectural choice that has some controversy around it, but it tends to solve most of the problems that you're talking about. And although I find it a very difficult argument to make, I currently believe it's the best architecture for most circumstances. All right.
So how does the render function get hold of the model that it's...
How does the render function get a hold of the model? Whenever you instantiate a view, I don't have it listed here, unfortunately. When instantiating a view, you specify the model. I think I accidentally put it up here under defining a view or collection class, which would have a different meaning. Instantiating a view, you specify what model object, what model instance you want that view to project, and then the render function is just going to ask the view, hey, what are we talking about again? What model are we associated with? When you instantiate a view, there will be an element created for you, a DOM element, and that DOM element is the thing that goes on the page. Basically, Backbone views are juiced up DOM nodes. They are fancy versions of jQuery objects, which are themselves fancy versions of DOM nodes, right? A jQuery object fundamentally attempts to abstract over the complexity of a DOM node, or a collection of DOM nodes, but that's not what this situation entails. A jQuery object that contains one DOM node is just a better API for interacting with that DOM node. A Backbone view is basically an even richer API for interacting with that jQuery object. So when you want to talk to that jQuery object directly, you talk about myViewInstance.el or myViewInstance.$el, where EL is the naked DOM node and $el is the jQuery wrapped DOM node. When you instantiate a view, you can specify what DOM node to use, but if you don't, one will be generated for you. And that's it. That's all the lingo. I have 7 minutes, so I'm going to take questions for a couple of them, but if you are wanting to come to the 4 o'clock talk, I recommend you take a bathroom break or whatever right now, unless you're super riveted by the answers to the questions that are about to be asked. But the next lecture is all about the sequence analysis of JavaScript classes. It'll be the culmination of all the work we've been doing in all of the previous fundamentals lectures. Yeah?
So,
talking about the last line, does it mean that it already includes jQuery?
Yes, Backbone usually depends on jQuery. I think Backbone, does it depend on it outright, or does it have a mode that can run without it?
What is it? I think you can run it like with Zepto or something.
But you have to have a dollar,
Yeah.
some DOM node querying provider. Yeah, so you need some DOM manipulation library, probably jQuery. Yeah.
What would be a scenario where you'd want to use Backbone over any of the other, maybe more full-featured frameworks like Ember or Angular?
Personally, the question was, when would you choose to use Backbone over other frameworks? Call me a curmudgeon. I am dissatisfied with all of the framework solutions that have been on offer for a while. Unfortunately, JavaScript is limited enough that they all represent different compromises. And so the question really becomes, when will I be forced to use one or other of these compromises? I think you'll be forced to use Backbone when using a heavier framework is impractical. Frameworks like Angular and Ember, full-featured though they may be, have a lot of complexity to them. So intuiting how they work is difficult if you're just starting, right? It will be an imposition on other developers. Backbone, I would argue, gets too complicated to be worth it pretty quickly, but if it's a small app, I think the simplicity that is its driving tenet is actually valuable for small enough apps. That said, I find the .get and .set, as well as some of the discord between its own features, like internal discord between its features, I find that challenging enough to hack around every time it pops up that I frankly just don't use the framework for much. But it's a great learning tool to learn about, like, how should a framework function, and how does a framework work, and what is the framework doing, and what is Backbone not doing for me today? That's why I want this other framework that's going to make huge impositions on me and require me to read tons of documentation. But it'll break less frequently because it has planned Angular has planned ahead for way more scenarios than Backbone has. Backbone runs into a wall of just unanticipated complexity quite frequently. Any other Backbone questions before we? Yeah.
I was going to ask for a quick summary on how extend works. Is the parameter that takes the hash, does it only look for specific parameters in there, or does it just take anything defined and tack it onto the object the way Angular extend does? How does .extend work? There are some special keys like initialize, but all the rest of them just go right on the prototype. Okay.
Every other property you pass becomes a property of the prototype of that class.
So my question just occurred to me, would you be able to seal the class by overriding extend with a no-op function?
By seal, do you mean...
Make it not extendable itself.
So the question is, could you seal the class by overriding extend with a no-op? You could seal it in as much as it would be difficult to accidentally extend that class, right?
Yeah.
But it would be trivial for someone to circumvent your sealing. They could just call extend.apply from my other model .extend.apply to that thing. So as a sort of like bookmark to yourself to prevent accidental misuse, yeah, you can do that. I would actually, instead of having a no-op, I would have it throw an error since you apparently want it to really explode whenever somebody tries to do that.
I was more just curious whether Backbone prevented you from overwriting some of its own base.
Great question. Does Backbone sort of prevent you from doing things like overwriting .extend? It can't for the same reasons that it has .set and .get. It has no way of knowing when you're hacking its properties unless it's checking them on some schedule, which sounds pretty inconvenient for the framework to do just to make sure you're not monkeying. Good question. Yeah?
I tend to confuse MVVM versus MVC, and does Backbone really belong to MVC? Does it follow MVC or MVVM?
The question is, is Backbone more of an MVC or more of an MVVM? And that question was prefaced by, I'm often confused by the distinction. I guess I would say I'm also confused by the distinction. I believe that the concepts of MVC are so fluid and so interpretable as meaning very many different types of things that to start proliferating the number of classifications of MVC is perhaps counterproductive. But if I had to pick one, I think MVVM is perhaps better in this case. That said, like, I think MVVM itself is poorly specified.
On that note, I was actually going to ask if you thought that the concept of creating an app model to encompass maybe some other models that need to be used at the same time in review was kind of VM from the MVVM.
Yes.
Model.
I actually, so this is a great question, and we're getting sort of lofty about MVC, which makes me happy because it's like one of my favorite topics. The fact that I advocate for a view model, or sorry, for a view model, does that seem to, or sorry, an app model, excuse me. The fact that I seem to advocate for an app model, does that imply that I am in favor of MVVM, either for Backbone or quite generally? I would say that in fact, having an app model strikes me as a rather non-optional aspect of any MVC application. It's optional in as much as you can avoid it, but you could also avoid ever having collections in any application, and you could just hack around it using other techniques for solving the problem of ordered lists of things. It'd be better if you just choose to have an actual ordered array-like sequence of things as opposed to giving everything a unique random name and then keeping those in a linked list. I don't know what you can do to hack around that. I believe that an app model is so important to any MVC or MVVM application that to try and write an application without it is to doom yourself to a lot of aimless academic questions about what is MVC really and how do I classify this behavior? Is it business logic, which I've still never heard a definition for? I think there are a lot of spurious questions out there, and they are linked to the fact that people feel uncomfortable defining a app model.
Do you consider the app model more part of the M, the V, or the C?
The M. I would say that the app model is very much an aspect of the model generally. And since we're on the topic, I'll make my defense for it. When a user uses an application, they interact with a lot of state that we wouldn't consider sort of pristine and abstract, like which users are following which users, and how old is this one user. These are things that we can all agree are so pristinely, blessed with modeliness that there's no controversy about whether that is state that the user cares about having consistently managed in some database somewhere. We become uncomfortable when we talk about state that seems to be best represented by the view system itself. So for example, when a pop-up box is open or not, and whether or not that pop-up box has been dismissed. These are states that the user can get themselves into as a result of navigating your application that many people want to call view state. They want to call that view logic or view state or something, and I think this is a contradiction in terms. As soon as you build an app where logging in on another computer later should show you the same pop-up as you were seeing before, you suddenly discover that that state was very important to your user, and you promote it out of this like subpar class of state where you put view state, and you say this is actually now lofted, abstraction state. I've been at several companies that have built notification trackers, special systems that keep track of whether or not a user has acknowledged a certain message that everyone in the system must see. We are upgrading our system on this day, or we've changed our terms and conditions. And they build these really different infrastructures to support this brand new animal. If we were to accept that state itself, like all state, is actually just related to perhaps a narrowly scoped user experience, but is related to the truth of what a user knows about the world, we wouldn't have a lot of these philosophical complaints about the differences between MVC and MVVM and so on and so forth. Okay, I think I'm a few minutes over. I've been talking a lot. My voice really hurts. So I'm thinking of taking like a 2-minute break to get some water. Maybe you guys need it as well. I'll take a 2-minute break and then we'll start our final installation of the fundamentals series.